Good afternoon. Welcome to our early Zoom arrivals. Thank you for being so prompt. We'll probably get started a little bit after 3, maybe a couple of minutes after, but get comfortable. Check your audio settings. If you can hear my voice, you're in great shape, and I'll check in with you in a few minutes. We should be getting started about 3:02 or so. So make yourself comfortable, check your audio setting, and you might look for the Q&A feature on Zoom, either at the top or bottom of your screen. That's where you'll be able to put in a question at any time during the program. We'll save all those questions until the end, but hope to answer all of them. So get comfortable. The program, as I said, will start a couple minutes after 3 and should conclude about 4:30 today. I'll be checking in with you in a few minutes. We're about to start the program. Welcome. Special welcome to those joining us by Zoom today. My name is Eileen McIntyre, and welcome to this fourth program in our Out of the Box series, organized by our hardworking Education Committee, which I'm privileged to chair. And now I will turn the podium over to the president of the Hingham Historical Society and chair of our Collections Committee, Paula Bagger, who will introduce today's topic and our speaker. Paula?
Thank you, Eileen, not only for the introduction, but for everything you're doing as chair of our Education Committee in making this lecture series possible. Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth lecture, in our 2021-2022 lecture series. That's okay. There should be a slide that has the title, but I think we can do it without. All right, there we go. Okay. As I say, our 2020-21-2022 lecture series, Out of the Box. It is our good fortune to have enticed Joel Bohy, a recognized expert on historic arms and military artifacts, to speak about our Militaria collection. This year, it seems like the world is confirming for us all of the adages we always trot out about the relationship between history, the study of the past, and our present, our today. We laughed last month when our extreme weather lecture was disrupted by, you guessed it, a blizzard. It's a little more sobering that our lecture on the artifacts of war is happening while the news is blanketed with the invasion of Ukraine, which is being described as the largest military attack in Europe in 80 years. That is, since World War II. And so we are reminded of the importance of the military engagements that the artifacts that we'll be talking about today represent, and their seriousness. The American Revolution, the Civil War, the two world wars, and the role of the people of Hingham in each of these. So to introduce our speaker now, Joel Bohy is the Director of Historic Arms and Militaria. Oh, I'm supposed to do this again. There we go. Is the Director of Historic Arms and Militaria at Bruneau Co. He's an active member of the American Society of Arms Collectors and a frequent writer and lecturer on historic arms, including recently at the Society for Historical Archaeology's Fields of Conflict Conference at Colonial Williamsburg, and at the Weapons of War Conference sponsored by the Concord Museum and Minuteman National Park, right up in Lexington and Concord. Joel recently co-authored a study of colonial era firearm bullet performance based on live fire experiments, which I believe he will refer to today. And a current research interest of his are the wooden canteens that the craftsmen of Hingham contributed to the Patriot effort during the early years of the Revolutionary War. He's going to say a few words about that fascinating and very Hingham-centric story before moving on to discuss some of the highlights of our Militaria collection from several of our country's wars. Joel will be speaking for about an hour, and then we'll be taking questions from, the studio audience and from those of you out in TV land. If you are remote, there is a question box into which you can type questions at any point that they occur to you during the lecture, although they will be answered at the end. And if you're here, we will raise a hand and pass the microphone when we're done. So without more, I'd like to introduce Joel Bohy.
Thank you, Paul and Eileen, for the invite. It's great to be here. I've been into the American Revolutionary War since I was a little kid. I grew up in Concord, Mass, right off the battlefield. And so when I was about 6 or 7, my parents would help feed that. We'd go out on the battlefield a lot, and it made me want to read a lot more about it, get into the primary documentation and material culture. So as a little kid, you know, just being infatuated with this stuff, it was kind of odd, but, you know, look where I am now. So like we said, we're going to talk about some things that are Hingham-centric first that we don't have an object for in the collection. And then we're going to move into some of the artifacts in the collection. And we're doing this first part because I want those of you here and those on Zoom to see what the early canteens look like that were coming out of Hingham and being supplied to the Army. And hopefully someone will look at that and maybe recognize one, and we can get one in the collection. And maybe somebody might know where there's some documentation in other little collections in town. I've been getting a lot of material from Mass Archives, American Antiquarian Society, Brookline Library, Concord, and trying to compile it all. And I'm only going to do a short section, and hopefully for the 250th, maybe I'll get asked back to do a whole thing on Hingham's canteens. So let's get rolling here. Obviously, my opening slide is a canteen, but we're going to talk about this one a little bit later. So talking about canteens at the start of the Revolution, we know there was a lot of canteens that were made and stored, and nobody really knew where they came from. There were a number on a page. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I got this canteen in from a collection. The people didn't know what it was. And as soon as I looked at it, I got really excited. It's what we call cheese box style, or single staved, which would be the ash stave that goes around the drum. And this particular one was marked Joseph Elliott, 1776. So doing some research, I was able to find Joseph Elliott from Taunton. He served during the siege of Boston. While at the Battle of Saratoga, he got sick, was shipped to the hospital in Albany, and then was too sick to be taken care of there. He was sent home and died 2 weeks later. The canteen, along with a few other items, were passed down through the family. And this one ended up with Charles Darwin Elliott, who was an engineer from Cambridge, Mass. And he had written a lot of books on engineering. And in one of his books, he mentioned the canteen being in his collection. So we were able to track it till then. And then I knew the person who had brought it in, his grandparents had bought Charles Darwin Elliott's surveying collection. The canteen happened to be in there. So when I saw the picture of the canteen, needless to say, I got excited. Now the canteen had 3 little iron wire loops. You can't really see them in the image, they're gone. You can see down just below the 6, there's some staining, 2 little dots. There was a half round iron wire loop that went through there. There was 3 of them on the canteen, and that's how it was slung over the shoulder. So it's very interesting. And when I got this, a colleague said to me, you know, you got to look at Darren Bray's great book, Bucket Town. And I'd heard about it, but I'd never looked at it. So I ran down the hall, grabbed a copy of it, started looking at it, and got his email and started corresponding a little bit with Darren, trying to figure out these canteens a little bit, because I knew he had worked with all the stuff in this collection. And so I started looking around for other canteens. And again, this book is a must-have if you do not have it in your collection. I ended up just getting it this summer here downstairs because I went to use somebody else's copy all the time. I figured, you know what, I got to get my own now. But it's a great book because he does discuss some of these early canteens, but there was a lot of missing information, and there still is, but I've been able to compile a decent amount. So who doesn't think of Benjamin Lincoln when you think of Hingham, right? Well, Benjamin Lincoln was a member of the Committee of Safety, Committee of Supplies, and he was in charge of canteens. So if you look at this document, I know it's a little hard to read. This is a bill of his that he put into Massachusetts from October 1774, right after the Provincial Congress formed, until December 30th, 1775. And he lists everything he did, including my time in purchasing powder, canteens, axes, tow cloth, et cetera, and procuring teams to cart them to the stores. The stores would have been in Concord. And that was October 27th, 1774 to the 15th of April, 1775, right before April 19th. This is in the Mass Archives collection. I've tried to cite where the things are so that you can see them. Now, the canteens had to get from Hingham to the stores in Concord. So Benjamin Lincoln hired John Goddard from Brookline, and luckily John Goddard's account books survive in the Brookline Library. And this again is a little hard to read. So there's a late 19th century transcription. April 10th, 1775, to carting 2 ox cart and 2 horse cart loads of canteens to Concord, along with 3 men to help remove the canteens. And then again, April 14th, to carting 1 ox cart and 1 horse cart load of canteens to Concord. So we know that Lincoln acquired them in this area, in Hingham area, then John Goddard transported them right before April 19th to Concord. Once they arrived in Concord, Colonel James Barrett, who some of you guys may have heard of, he was in charge of all the warlike stores for the colony, and he had assistant Jonas Haywood, also from Concord. And this list is about 5 pages of all the material that was coming into town and where it was stored in town. So we know pretty much where each house was that stored the material and how much was there. And on this document, received of John Goddard, 4 load, 2 ox teams, 2 horse teams, with tow cloth and canteens stored at Ephraim Potter's house. So now we know the canteens came from Hingham, got transported by John Goddard to Concord, and we know they're at Ephraim Potter's house. On April 18th, they had a committee of supplies meeting, which Lincoln was at, and they decided things were getting close. They knew the British were going to be marching soon, and they did not want the British to get the supplies that were stored in Concord and other towns, but Concord was going to be the main goal of the British push. So they decided to split the canteens into 3 batches, 5,000 each, put some in Stowe, some in Sudbury, and the 5,000 in Concord. But that was on April 18th. The British formed up that night to march to Concord, and they never got a chance to move the canteens. So there were 15,000 of them stored at Ephraim Potter's barn. And this great Amos Doolittle Plate 2, you can see Concord Center, Wright's Tavern, right in front in the center. The red building is still there. If you've been to Concord, you've driven by it. And you can see Lieutenant Colonel Smith and Major Pitcairn with the eyepiece looking towards the North Bridge at the provincials that had formed, watching what the British were doing in town. And you can see British troops scattered through town. Over to the right of this image is the townhouse where there were supplies. And over to the left on the other side of that pond is Ebenezer Hubbard's house. He had flour, barrels of flour stored there. And the British were dumping the flour into the mill pond. And they took some of the cannon shot, musket shot, threw that into the mill pond, you can see. And they lit some of the wooden bowls and spoons and gun carriages on fire, which caught the townhouse on fire, which ended up starting the battle. But luckily for the canteens, Ephraim Potter's house was not in the center of Concord. It was just outside of town, about 1.5 miles towards the town of Sudbury. And his house still survives. Now the canteens, 15,000 of them, wouldn't have been in his house. I'm sure his wife would not have been happy about that. So they would have been in the barn, and we think the barn would have been over. You can see to the left of the image, there's a fence line. Right on the other side of that fence line is Route 2 West. So the barn probably sat right where Route 2 is, and people drive through it, commute to and from Boston every day, right through where the canteens are stored. So April 19th, the battles begin, and April 20th, there's a council of war, and they decide, with all the troops surrounding Boston, there was about 5,000 by the end of the day on April 19th and about 20,000 by the next morning. And they needed to feed these troops, outfit them, and they needed to get some of these supplies that have been stored in Concord and other towns into the army. So the supplies start to be moved in. And here we have received of Captain Jonas Howard of Concord, which is actually Jonas Haywood, 834 canteens by the hand of Ephraim Potter. So now those canteens from Hingham are now ending up in Cambridge to go into stores. And they had to do it in batches because they didn't have the teams were so busy carrying in materials that they had to bring them in little batches. And I've got all those different batches that I found, which we're not going to go through. You'll be happy about that. And now, okay, now you've got all these canteens and you need to issue them to the soldiers. So in the account books at Mass Archives are every listing for materials that came into them and went out. So there are a lot of listings for canteens being issued. And here we have, this is Colonel Prescott's regiment. Many of you guys have heard of Colonel Prescott's regiment from the Battle of Bunker Hill. But here's 60 canteens and lines for the canteens. Okay. Then we've got 110 canteens and lines for ye same. So what the heck are the lines? So a line, it turns out, is just a piece of string. It's a thin linen twisted cord. And it was cheap. There was a lot of it available. And it's the only thing that would fit through those little D loops I was telling you about, those little iron wire loops on that canteen. And British canteens, although tin, use lines also. So you can see the same line being used on the British canteens. It's funny, I had someone say, wow, that'd be awful uncomfortable. It's like, but you know, British were doing it, Continentals did it, it was cheap, it worked. You know, I'm sure they didn't care too much about the soldiers and their comfort, but they needed them to have water. So you can see the different sides, you can see the twist on the linen cord. Yep. Yeah, it would be slung on the left side. So George Washington takes command on July 3rd, 1775, and immediately he asks for a list of all the provisions that he has and all the supplies, arms, everything that he has for his use. And among that, even though they've been issuing all these canteens, there's still 13,000 canteens in stores. So how did that happen? There had to have been other canteens coming in during that time. So after I had sold the other canteen, the Joseph Elliott canteen, I started to get all sorts of emails with people who had canteens. And there were a lot of later 1812 era federal period, everything to Boy Scouts and modern stuff. But this one was interesting. It's almost identical to the Joseph Elliott canteen in its construction with the ash band or stave and pine drums. And you can see the old growth pine, you can see that really tight grain. But this one on the face here on the drum was marked RM 1775. Thought that was super cool. And then it was stamped with a maker's mark of I.B on the other side of the drum. And at that point I contacted Darren. I'm like, do you have anybody in Hingham with those initials? And we couldn't find anybody. And here you can see those iron wire loops I was talking about a little clearer. This particular one is bent over. They're not a real sturdy way to carry the canteen. And some of them have either 5 rows head nails to close the stave or 6. And you can see here, here's another iron wire loop that's been pushed into the canteen, so you couldn't even get the line through it. And here's 3 in a collection of a friend of mine. The top one is the RM 1775 canteen. And you can see that the bottom 2, which are both Massachusetts canteens also, see how round the hole is for the stopper? Well, when I got the RM 1775 canteen, I noticed the hole was elongated. And when I looked inside, I knew it had been in a barn in Massachusetts for probably a few hundred years. It was filled with mouse corpses and insulation and nest material. It was disgusting. So the mice had chewed that opening a little bit to make it a home. So I had to go through with long needle nose pliers and pull all that stuff out. But it was worth it. Because I think we found out who IB is. So on this document, again from Mass Archives, we have the list of canteens going into Cambridge, not Roxbury too, just Cambridge, from whom received and from when received, and the load numbers and the dates. So here we have the top, Colonel Lincoln, because Benjamin Lincoln was a colonel at the time, by Mr. Amos Sprague from Hingham. He shipped in 1,322 canteens. Then you see John Goddard. He actually trucked the stuff in. So that's who it was received from, but it probably came from Hingham. And then at the bottom, you can see July 16th, Israel Beale from Hingham delivered 216 canteens. So although we can't say for sure, he's out of all the receipts I have for canteen makers, he's the only one with an IB or a JB. So there's a pretty good chance that canteen was made in Hingham by Israel Beale, which I think is fascinating. The other thing is on this document, you see 5,405 canteens delivered between May 5th and July 16th, 1775, plus the 15,000 that were in Concord. That's 20,405 canteens just that I can find in these 2 documents, let alone others, because today I did some research before this talk on the Hawks Fearing account book in the collection here. And I found more deliveries coming from Hingham going to Roxbury. So I have all the Roxbury books on my computer now. I photographed them before COVID, but now I've got to sit down and go through thousands of documents to pull all the canteen stuff up. Yes, I know I'm crazy. And speaking of Hawks Fearing account book, which I just went through this morning and popped these slides in, part of the fun of this for me is going through this stuff and finding little nuggets that help put the story together. Because as you can see, I've got stuff from Mass Historical Society, American Antiquarian Society, Concord, here, all these little pieces help put the story together. And I know it's just canteens, but it's still pretty exciting. So here we have canteens being delivered to Roxbury. So that's what I was mentioning, that list of numbers for Cambridge, the 20,000 canteens, that was just Cambridge. There was still more going into Roxbury. So that's a lot of canteens being made down here and shipped in for the Army. And here's a listing in that book from Benjamin Lincoln for canteens and pails, wooden pails being shipped from Hingham to the Army, to the Siege of Boston. So I look forward to coming back and going through some of the other account books. Paul has given me a list. So we're hoping we can get back through them again, and then I can put all this data together into a really exciting talk. And then 17, so this went on through the whole war. So one thing you have to remember is tin canteens, which the British were using, tin had to be imported. And so there wasn't a lot on hand at the time when the war broke out. So they needed that for other things. They couldn't use it for just canteens. So what did we have a lot of in this area? Wood. And the people in Hingham in this area who were able to make them quickly and make thousands of them. So through the war, there were a lot of these canteens still being made in Hingham and shipped in. And this particular document is Edward Mitchell, Theophilus Cushing, William Drew, coming up with another 1,500 canteens for an expedition into Charlestown, New Hampshire, which is up by Fort Number 4. And this is the original resolve that I found, and then it was printed in all the newspapers at the time too. Sometimes newspaper searches are a lot of fun. You can find little nuggets of information on people doing these searches. And then another Hingham supplier, Caleb Loring. Now, I was explaining earlier to Eileen, the way that the Mass Archives collection is set up, there's like 329 volumes, big volumes, and a few of them have indexes and a lot of them don't. So you have to go through every slip of paper. And this particular document for Caleb Loring is in one volume, talking about 988 canteens being delivered, wooden canteens. Then this document says 1,000 canteens, but if you look at the bottom or towards the bottom, it says 12 missing. So that's the 988. So these two documents actually went together, but they're 100 volumes apart. So you got to go through and kind of put all this stuff together. So now we're going to get out of early canteens and we're going to move on to some other stuff. And this is one of my absolute favorites in the collection, is the Reverend Daniel Shute overcoat. It's extremely rare. There's only a handful of 18th century overcoats that survive. There's a few at Mass Historical Society made out of a heavier, thick woolen broadcloth. A lot of times they're scarlet. And those stand up better to time, but there's, again, only a handful. Colonial Williamsburg Foundation may have one or two. But when I came in one day and saw that, I almost fell over because it's a really fine woolen or woolen and silk plain woven material, and it just shouldn't survive. It should have been eaten and gone by now, but luckily it's still here. And as soon as I saw it, I let some textile historians know about it. And I think actually Henry Cook from Randolph actually came up to look at it. And I know Williamsburg wants to look at it too, but COVID had hit and kind of stopped that for a while. But hopefully we can get some other textile folks up here to look at it, because it is really, really neat. And Reverend Daniel Shute was the minister of the second parish. It's kind of neat to drive by there on the way in today from my home and see the church where he might have worn this in and out of. It dates to about circa 1760, 1780. These things didn't change a whole lot over time. They didn't need to. As other clothing styles, breeches, waistcoats, coats changed in form a little bit. Some earlier stuff would have been adapted so they didn't waste cloth, but overcoats were pretty much, they were unchanged for quite a while. And here you can see the back. It's got this great cape that covers the shoulders. When he was walking to and from church, he wouldn't get rain on his soak through into his clothing. And you can see here the inner collar is lined with velvet. And the reason for that is if you've ever worn a woolen shirt, your neck gets chafed raw wearing it. And so they lined it with this black cotton velvet so it would be more comfortable when you wore it. The other thing you can see in here is that white line down that inner facing. That's the selvage edge of the cloth. So when they were making this stuff, they didn't waste anything. They used every bit of the cloth they possibly could, including the selvage edges. And the other thing with the selvage edges is this material is really lightweight and it frays. That will hold the edge so that they don't have to do anything to it other than just tack it down. It won't unravel. And you can see the shoulder seam that runs down. You can see the fraying. Normally on a broadcloth overcoat or coat or clothing, you would have about a quarter-inch seam allowance because that any more than that would be wasteful. And on this one, it's about a half or 5/8 because it had to stay together so it didn't fray and come apart. Here's the cape, and the cape is lined, and you can see there's a center back seam on the cape. And again, not wasting cloth. When they put the cape liner in, it's pieced. You have the center seam, but then there's a couple of other seams. So they pieced the cloth together because it was underneath. It didn't matter. They weren't going to waste it. Cloth was more expensive than labor. So it was easier for them to utilize the material they had and spend a little more time on it. Here we are talking about salvage edges again. Here's 2 salvage edges that they stitched together because again, it's on the inside of the overcoat and it didn't matter. Nobody was ever going to see it. And here's more salvage edges on the center back seam, other piecing that was done. And you can see those linen reinforcement pieces. Those are for the buttons on the back. The material is so fine that if you pulled on that without the reinforcement piece, it would pull the button right off, right through the cloth. So they used a linen backing to strengthen it and hold it in place. Now we're going to talk about one of my other favorite things, muskets. One of the things that I've been doing for the past 5 or 6 years is live fire ballistics study of 18th century arms. Now that doesn't mean we're using actual 18th century arms because you would want to damage the gun or damage yourself if something happened. But we had custom built guns made from the originals, and we've set up with high-speed ballistics cameras, shooting live and collecting all the data for archaeology. We're also collecting, we collect the musket ball and collect the data from the musket ball so that we could share it with archaeologists. And this gun in the collection is a British pattern 1769 Shortland. Now it's had a couple of things done to it, like many things from that period. They didn't remain unchanged. A musket that is untouched is kind of a rarity. This one had a lock replaced on it. And you can see in this image, the lower image, there's a side screw, this lock screw, and there's a hole in front of it. The original lock, that screw would have sat in that hole in the front. So you can see that it was moved back to fit this new lock. And so here's the lock that's in the gun. You can see what I was just talking about with the side nail or lock screw being moved back a little bit, but the lock is from a French musket. It's from either a 1728, more than likely a 1746. So it's not the right lock for the gun, but someone fitted it to it. And at some point, maybe we'll do a borescope of that gun and see if it had been converted to percussion in the 19th century and then converted back to flint, which may be the case. But we can run a borescope down there. We can see if that was done to it, and that might answer a few more questions as to why this lock is in the gun. Now, this is the lock that it should have. It's a British pattern 1755 lock. You can see on the tail it says Tower, and underneath the pan in the front, in the middle of the lock plate, is a crown over GR, and there's a British ordnance mark underneath the pan also. So this is the pattern lock that would have been in that gun. And by the way, that gun is over here on the table, as are a few of the other objects we're going to talk about today. So afterwards, if you want to take a look at some of the stuff, we can look at it. And other things that have been done to it, the stock was spliced, whether it was half stocked in the 19th century, and then a piece added later when it was reconverted, we don't know. But there are also a couple of other things done. There's a piece of sheet brass that's holding on that ramrod entry pipe. And the bayonet lug has been moved to the bottom of the barrel. You can just see that little nub right where on the edge of the table. And the ramrod is a replacement. It's not the original ramrod for the gun. And here's the top where the bayonet lug was that was filed off. The British pattern 1769 has a top bayonet lug on it. So at some point, somebody had an underlug bayonet that they wanted to fit to it. So they just popped another lug on and took this one off. But the cool thing about this gun is on the wrist plate, it's engraved to the 22nd Regiment of Foot, British regiment. It fought in America. They came to Boston right after Bunker Hill, which was in June 1775. They evacuated Boston on March 17th, 76, and sailed to Halifax, Nova Scotia with the rest of the troops that evacuated Boston. They were in the New York campaigns, New Jersey. The Light Infantry Company participated in the Philadelphia campaign of 1777. The battalion company occupied Newport, the battalion companies, there were 8 battalion companies in a regiment, occupied Newport, Rhode Island, participating in the Battle of Rhode Island. And they later participated in the Southern campaigns in the 1780s, eventually surrendering with Cornwallis at Yorktown in 1781. We don't know when the gun was picked up. Could have been at the Battle of Rhode Island. Could have been at Yorktown. We just don't know. But that regimental marking is really cool. I've seen other guns from the 22nd that were engraved by the same hand. The one on the right is at the Cody Firearms Museum in Wyoming. And that particular gun was engraved by someone who had a little more skill than the one on the gun here. You can see the 22 RT, the E and the number 2 on the Cody gun is really finely engraved. And the 22 RGT B45 on the Hingham gun is not engraved as nicely, obviously. But it's great to have that identification to a British regiment that fought in the Revolution. A lot of times the British muskets are marked to the regiment on the top of the barrel. So there's a few different units that did this, but the 22nd, I think, is one of the ones that we've seen the most of with these type of markings. So some basics on the gun. The barrel lengths on these pattern 69s are 42 inches. The pattern 1756, which came out before this one, had a 46-inch barrel, and they ended up shortening them on these guns on the 69s. And they were issued initially to light infantry companies in 1771. And by the start of the Revolution, light infantry companies, and they had started to mix them in with some of the other battalion companies and grenadier companies, but they didn't have enough. So a lot of the battalion and grenadiers still had the earlier gun. Overall length is 58 inches. The bore diameter on this gun is 79 caliber. You hear a lot of people say that British muskets are 75 caliber. Well, not necessarily. This particular gun is 79. The average bore diameter is 78 caliber. I've sampled 78 different British muskets, taken the bores on each gun and put them into a spreadsheet. And we've averaged it to see kind of what they are. And we're splitting hairs here between 75, 76 and up, but it does make a difference when you're shooting the gun with how accurate it's going to be by this, also with the size of the ball that goes down the bore, which we'll get to in a minute. But so the balls that go into the gun, the government allows 11 bullets in the pound for proofing of muskets, which is a bigger ball that you would put in to proof the gun to make sure the barrel's not going to blow up. And then for service, it was 14 in the pound or 29 in 2 pounds, which equals, if you look at this little chart, 14 ball to the pound equals 0.693. Now, did they ever get them that close? No. Nope. Here's a British musket ball fired on April 19th, 1775. It was taken out of the roof rafter of the Merritt and Nathan Monroe House right across the common. The British, when they were retreating back from Concord, fired on the house, and it went up through the back, through probably a window, and lodged in the central roof rafter. And it was pulled out in 1915 by some workmen who found it. And you can see this little pry mark on the top where they took a tool and pried it out of the beam. And I've been there. I'm doing a study on all known bullet strikes from April 19th, 1775. And I've been into the house and I've seen where the ball stuck in the rafter. There's still a mark where it lodged itself. And you can see on that ball, there's some wood left from that oak rafter in the center of the house. Ball sizes, found archaeologically range from about 0.67 to 0.71, with an average base of average base of 0.68. And that's from about 148 musket balls that I've studied that were found archaeologically. I've weighed each one. The ones that were dropped, I've checked. You can see with the calipers here on the table with those other British musket balls. So I've got an Excel spreadsheet of musket balls too. Yeah, I know. So how does the gun function? This is one of the fun parts of doing all these studies, is actually going out and shooting the guns. So this is one of the custom built guns that I had made. And this is a shot. Now, there were two British musket balls found that were fired at the Boston Massacre. They're at Mass Historical Society. And they were fired at Edward Payne. And now I'm whacking the mic. Hit him in the arm, lodged in the door, and then one went through into his back wall. So those two balls survived. And historians had said, well, maybe they fired two ball at a time. And this shot, I was firing two ball, which was not fun. It's got a lot of kick, but you can see this flint is hitting the steel. The sparks go into the pan where there is some powder. The charge and the powder and the charge have already been put down the barrel. Now this right now is just the powder in the pan that's going off. That's not even the powder that's in the gun yet. And then in a couple seconds, you're going to see when the gun actually goes off. But this is all just from that powder. And it's funny shooting it. You don't see this. It's like poof. Watching the video, you can really see how it works. In about a second here, the gun's going to go off. And you're going to see a flame shoot out through the vent. Boom. Yeah. That I did it 3 times. And I'll tell you, my shoulder was bruised after that. It was not a lot of fun. But we proved with those two musket balls, one of them fell on the ground. The muzzle velocity dropped so much from 2 musket balls being in that gun that one of them fell on the ground about 30, 40 yards out. And the other one came close to the 100-yard target, but it dropped on the ground too. And these cameras will record the muzzle velocity, and it dropped dramatically. So could you anger somebody hitting them? Yeah, maybe if you're up close, you might badly hurt somebody. But when you fire a single ball, you can go through 3 or 4 people, especially at the massacre when everybody was so crowded in together. More crazy stuff. So now the other end, what comes out of the gun? This is a 69 caliber ball fired at 32 inches of ballistics gelatin. And on the front, where you can see the ball where it's hovering in midair, there's a piece of broadcloth, or a couple pieces of English broadcloth that we put on the face of it, because we wanted to see if we could collect. We had seen musket balls found archaeologically that had a cloth imprint on it, and we wanted to see if we could replicate that data. But we also wanted to see how far the cloth would travel into the wound, because that's how a lot of soldiers, if they didn't die from the musket ball, they ended up with sepsis, and so we wanted to see that. And this one, you can see the ball going in. Look at the cavitation from that ball. It's just hitting a human body. It's unimaginable, the damage that it could do. But if you watch the ball, it gets about 3/4 through the second block and it exits the side. And you can see there was cloth left in the gel, but that takes up, see it coming out? And there's a piece of cloth behind it. So it left some of the cloth in the wound, and then it carried some of the cloth out of the hole of it. But I mean, still, the cavitation is just awful. So now that we've discussed everybody talking about cavitation and musket balls, we've got this spontoon in the collection. It's late 18th to early 19th century. It's in really good condition, nice form, and it said that it belonged to Ezekiel Fearing, Hingham resident.
What did you call it?
You can't see the, how come, where is it?
But I just didn't hear the word you said.
Oh, spontoon. Sorry about that. We need somebody smarter than me to do this. There we go. Is that better? Okay, and the spontoon is on the table over here also. So it's said to have belonged to Ezekiel Fearing. So I went through and I looked up 1812 service records. He was said to be an officer in the War of 1812. Now we're not moving. There we go. Thank you. Ezekiel Fearing was a sergeant in the 2nd Regiment Massachusetts Militia. So he would not have been carrying that. How he ended up with it, who knows? But he would not have carried that arm. So what's a spontoon? Right? A spontoon is for officers. It's in this image by Don Triani. You can see this Continental Army officer, circa 1780-83. He's wearing the uniform of a Continental officer. You can see he's got a sword slung over his left shoulder, and he's carrying a spontoon. So a spontoon is basically a badge of rank, so you can tell where the officers are. But it also has a use. In this little excerpt I took from a Universal Military Dictionary, a British dictionary from 1779 on military matters, it describes it as a spontoon as a weapon, much like a halberd, now used instead of a half pike by the officers of foot. When the spontoon is planted, when it's dropped into the ground, the regiment halts. When pointed forwards, when you put the point forwards, the regiment marches forward. And when pointed back, the regiment retreats. So it's a way for guys with guns firing, everything else, to see what their commands are going to be from the officer. And they're cool to hang on the wall. Canteens again, yay. I can see all the excitement. But this is a little different. These are canteens made by Elisha Burr from Hingham. Obviously the canteen and woodworking continued. This one it was carried by Hawks Fearing Jr. It's marked to him. And it's got this great paint with a kind of star right over the E. Burr mark, the Elisha Burr mark. And now on these canteens, you notice the stave or band that goes around the drum is a little thicker than those earlier ones. The majority of these are also painted, and they're slung a little differently. They have a leather tab, and there are some Rev War ones, later Rev War ones that have this leather tab too. But all of these have a leather tab for a half-inch strap or whatever they're going to put through it to sling it over their shoulder. Not the wire that's on it now. They didn't use those. Another cool thing, and this is also, the canteen is on the table with a couple of the others, and this really cool militia pack from the 3rd Regiment is over there too. It's got a great yellow paint, linseed oil-based paint to waterproof it. On the flap, which you can see with the 70 and the blue border, the 3rd Regiment, but the back, they didn't paint, which doesn't really make much sense because the water is going to get down there too. And you can see the water stains on there, whether they're sweat or from rain going over the soldier's back. You can also see where the straps are folded up on it now, but you can see where they were attached. It's a very fragile strap, and they broke off who knows how long ago. You can see here the way that it was loaded. It was just a simple bag. You put your stuff in, and then the leather tabs would buckle down with these tinned iron buckles. I love these packs. There's a great collection of these. If you ever go to Sturbridge Village and look in their militia section, they've got a lot of these Elisha Burr canteens too, and painted knapsacks. And some of these canteens, when you look at them on the table, they have some great paint jobs on them. Just kind of a cool period for kind of folk art on this stuff. And here's another Elisha Burr canteen in the collection, which is also on the table. Great sunburst with the initials in it. You can see the E. Burr marking again. And this one has a couple of paper labels on it. These canteens were made for and carried by the soldiers in the American Revolution. They were afterwards used by the soldiers in the War of 1812. M&F Burr took them in their store and sold them in Boston. A bill of the same for over 1,000 made by Elisha Burr for M&F Burr is preserved. The price paid was 15 cents each. The hoops are of native white oak. The heads are of eastern pine brought from Maine. Now, I don't know whether they were talking about this particular canteen being from the Revolution, because it's not, but this little note too, the canteen belonged to David Sprague, born in Hingham, May 14th, 1754, died in 1832, a soldier of the Revolution. This is, again, around an 1812 era canteen, so it was not carried in the Revolution. I mean, I think you can see the differences now between the two canteens I showed at the beginning and these two Elisha Burke canteens. While they may look the same, they're not. And then this, we were looking for this a little while ago to bring out. Uncomfortable but elegant, or maybe a little goofy. This is probably one of the most uncomfortable things that a soldier would have to wear. It's jacked leather or blackened leather, Japan leather. Almost looks like an anteater snout on the top of it, where you can see the star, the brass star, and there's wool worsted cords that hang off of that star pattern on the snout. There's a red plain woven broadcloth band, metallic tape around the top and bottom of that red band, and then patriotic eagles on the front and sides, and a brass visor. I mean, I'd love to have seen the rest of the uniform that went with this helmet. This is a great item in the collection too. It's never seen one quite like this before. Another thing that found when we were kind of going through some of the clothing a while back was this great militia officer's coat tee from about 1825, 1835, somewhere in that era. Really hard to say exactly. It's got an indigo dyed blue broadcloth body, buff cuffs and facings and collar. And you can see the back has buff trim on the pocket flaps. It's really nicely made, really beautiful piece. Got militia buttons, and you can see that false buttonhole. That's all hand worked just for looks. And I've done a lot of those, and it takes a lot of time. This is probably mohair or silk twist that they've worked these false buttonholes on. And they're all the way up the coat. They're on the pockets. They're on the vent in the back. There's a lot of work just to make it look cool. You can see the hand stitching too. Look at the little pick stitches that go down the edge of the facing. Cool thing. Another cool item in the collection, which I've never seen one of these before, is a Lincoln Light Infantry powder box. It's made of tinned iron and then japanned or painted over. It's marked to the Lincoln Light Infantry Company I, 4th Regiment, 1854. Here's the back. You can see it says powder on the top, and there's 3 carry handles. It may have been used to carry powder, but they also may have carried packs of prepared cartridges in it. So you'd have a pack of 10 cartridges all together, and they were a little rectangle, and you could stack them in that box all the way to the top, and then you had enough handles because it was going to be heavy. You could carry it with a lead ball. But it's, you just don't see this type of thing around. And probably this grouping that we're going to talk about of items is probably one of my most favorite, because it covers a lot of time, and not just military. We talk about his civilian life too, but there's this great tintype of Loring Cushing. He mustered into service in the 43rd Massachusetts Militia, Company K, on August 18th, 1862. Now, the 43rd Massachusetts Militia was a unit that was called out when Lincoln called for 300,000 volunteers in 1862. The 43rd Massachusetts Militia was one of those units that got called up. So Loring Cushing joined the unit, and this image of him shows him in his forage cap, his model 1858 forage cap, his coat, dress coat, with a nice silk cravat, and love that facial hair. Maybe I'll do that with this. Maybe not. So the 43rd Regiment, who were they? What did they do? Where did they train? Well, they started at Camp Meigs in Reedville, Massachusetts, which is near Roxbury. It's not too far from here. They departed on October 24th, 1862, and they were assigned to Major General John G. Foster's Department of North Carolina, later designated as the 18th Corps. They started numbering the corps that way in, I believe, May of 1863. So it was fairly new when he got in. The regiment was stationed in New Bern, North Carolina. In December, the regiment took part in the Goldsboro expedition. The objective of this maneuver was to disrupt the Confederate supply line along the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad by destroying the Goldsboro Bridge. During this expedition, the unit was lightly engaged in the battles of Kinston, Whitehall, and Goldsboro Bridge. While based in New Bern, the 43rd participated in patrols, reconnaissance expeditions, and returned to Boston in July, mustered out July 30th. And you can see by the bottom numbers here, they didn't see a lot of combat. They had 2 men killed in action and 12 by disease. Like a lot of Civil War units, there were other units that lost a lot in combat, but they were also lost a lot by disease also. But luckily, Loring Cushing came home. So I was able to pull his service record from the National Archives. And it's pretty standard. You can see when he mustered in, when he mustered out, and every time they did a muster roll, they created a document and then these cards when they put the archives documents together. But one of them is kind of fun. Here, he was talking about he needed to get some back pay, but they took a stoppage on his pay. He lost his haversack and canteen. Now, in the Civil War, they carried a tarred canvas haversack to keep your food in. It was just for your rations to be in, and then you would wear it over here on your left side, and you have your canteen on it. Cartridge box would be on the right. So he must have taken the 2 of them off together and set them down somewhere, and he lost them, and they made him pay for them. So the Historical Society is lucky to have some really wonderful Loring Cushing objects, not just the picture. You have his model 1858 forage cap here. It's made out of indigo blue broadcloth. And you can see the crown, the top where the numbers are, the K43. It looks a little wobbly. They made these with cardboard underneath the cloth. So you can imagine that when they got wet, what they were going to do, they were going to look kind of like an accordion. You can see the visor and the chin strap. Those are jacked leather again. They're blackened, painted leather, and they're die cut when they're assembled by the contractors. On the back, kind of running around a few inches up from the bottom, you can see that line of stitching. That's logwood dyed linen thread. The contractors are trying to cheap out. Logwood dye was cheaper than indigo. So they used the logwood, and then over a little bit of time, the blue would turn brown. So you can see a lot of the uniforms that were made with that thread, they've all changed to brown. You can see that little badge on the back of the crown. We'll have to talk about that in a minute. So collectors call this the Type 1 forage cap because of the small crown and the large visor. But you see the K43, K over 43, and you see that badge on the back. Now, Loring Cushing was a member of the 18th Army Corps. We just talked about that. That's a 6th Corps badge. I don't know, somebody must have put that on at another time because it's not the right Corps badge for his Corps. Or maybe he put it on later, I don't know. But that's what it is. You can see the lining here. It's a brown polished cotton lining. Now, this originally would have had a paper label inside with the contractor's name and size, but it was only put on with a little dab of glue. So a lot of times when they're worn in service, the little paper pops out and goes away. You can see the cross-hatched brown leather sweatband, and you can really get a good shot at the underside of that leather visor. You can see over time what happens to that black finish that's on it. A lot of times they've changed shape, and sometimes if you laid it on a piece of paper, the paper will stick to it if it's in a humid environment. But it does over time. They do get a little crazy looking. And his overcoats here, which is also on the form in the back of the room. When I first looked at this, I thought it was really, really interesting because normally these overcoats are all made from a cloth called kersey, sky blue kersey. And this particular example is made, it's not made from kersey. Here's the back of it. And it was made by a government contractor, John T. Martin. It's got the label on the inside of the sleeve cap. So you can see the little stamp on the bottom is Martin's contract stamp. And above that is the inspector who inspected it before it went into service. So all the garments were made by either Schuylkill Arsenal in Philadelphia. They couldn't keep up with demand when the war was going on, so they had to go to contractors. So Martin was just one of the many contractors to make thousands, hundreds of millions of pieces of clothing. But each one had to be inspected before it was accepted by the government. So on the left is a piece of all wool kersey, which is standard for overcoats and trousers during the American Civil War. But when I started to look at that one, I was like, wait a minute, this isn't kersey, this is satinette or jean cloth. I've only seen a couple other examples made in this material. It's cheaper to manufacture because they're using a woolen yarn and a cotton yarn, and then they finish it to make it look like it would be a kersey. But when it starts to wear, you can see the cotton weave underneath it. And it's just a little more flimsy. It's not as heavy. It's not going to be as warm, and it's not going to last as long. However, saying that, here it is on a form over here. So it did last a long time. We also have his knapsack, which is on the table. You can see it. It's really fragile. The straps are, the leather straps are really fragile on it. But you can see, like the earlier canteen, or the earlier knapsack, sorry, it was painted to waterproof it. This one, they painted the flap. It's all black. You got leather straps on the front to close it at the bottom. When you lift up that flap, there's a little compartment with two leather straps, and you can almost see, if you look around the border, there's a wooden frame that keeps its form. And then when you lift up that little flap, right now it's got acid-free tissue paper in it to keep it filled out. But you would be able to fold your shirt, socks, drawers, all that stuff, and keep it nicely inside the pack, and hopefully dry when it rained. So, and there's the back of the pack, and you can see in this case, they did paint it. They did paint it to waterproof the back, and it's got a suspension system. You can see at the bottom center, there's a buckle, and that central strap comes down. You could adjust it up and down for your size. And on the top of it, where the straps are up in the air here, there's one little strap you can see off to the left. That strap would have been to roll up the overcoat and put it on the top of the pack when you're marching, or your blanket. You could roll up your blanket, and they're basically blanket roll straps. So after the service, Loring Cushing comes home and he goes back to work, and he's making, obviously, you guys have probably seen a lot of this stuff, his wooden toys. And I love this business card, famous the world over. Made by Loring H. Cushing, High Street, South Hingham, Mass. And this is great. These toys are especially desirable for church fairs, Christmas gatherings, and children's festivals. Ooh. Saved by the Bell. All right. Now that's. So talking about newspaper searches again, I love sitting around every once in a while, and I'll go through and start searching names of canteen makers or muskets or cartridge boxes, all these different things online. I was like, I'm going to check out Loring Cushing. I found a whole bunch of stuff on the searches about him. And this one was great. Hingham's toy makers traveling the path which was laid out 75 years ago. And here's Loring Cushing and Augustus L. Hudson living up to the firmly established traditions of quality, even in small things, the toys. This is great. Blew up the image of him sitting working on a toy at 70 years old, 1911. He's still cranking out the toys. Would have loved to have met him. He must have been a character. And it looks like from this little image, I can't see for sure, but does he still have some funky facial hair going on there? So another great thing in the collection are some of the things that he made. Some of the toys that he made are here. And there's a few of them out on the table over here. You got this great secretary, a little toy secretary miniature, and a sideboard or desk that he created. And a little table and this reeded rocking chair. Look at the seat on that. And the thing's like this big, making a little reeded seat, everything. Talented guy. And one of my favorites, which is also over here on the table, is a toy that he made early in his life. It says on the bottom he made it when he was 6. Maybe not, maybe a little bit later. But it's just super cool with a fish for a weather vane. And I guess that is the second parish church that he copied it from, that he went to. Is that right, Paul, you think? Yeah, and that was also Daniel Schute's church that he was reverend of with the overcoat. And when I go home, I'm going to be driving right back by it again. I have to stop and take a picture. Another thing we found digging around in the collection is this First Corps Cadets, sometimes called the Independent Corps Cadets McDowell style forage cap. And it's called a McDowell style because of that rounded visor that goes long into the sides. It's shallow in the front and the crown. And it was named after General Irvin McDowell during the Civil War. But this is just post-Civil War era. It's got lieutenant's braid on the top of the crown. You can see it. And then there's an embroidered insignia that says 1cc for the Corps Cadets. The Corps Cadets started in about 1740, 1741. They're a militia unit out of the Boston area. And right prior to the Revolutionary War, John Hancock was their colonel. When the British occupied Boston and left in 76, obviously while occupation was going on, they couldn't do anything. But after they left, a lot of them went into the service, a few of them in Jackson's regiment, which Paul and I were talking about a little earlier. And so they served for many years through the Revolutionary War, 1812 up through the Civil War. And now the unit is an MP unit. Their lineage goes all the way back to these guys as an MP unit in Lexington, Mass. That has a history going back to the original First Corps. And they have a great little museum in Boston, which probably nobody's ever seen before. I got in there with some National Guard guys a couple of years ago, right before COVID, and they have some really cool things. And here's the lining on this one. You can see the leather sweatband. This one's black polished cotton. You can see the manufacturer, Benton Bush, with a gilt stamp on the crown lining. They were a big military supplier in Boston in the last part of the last half of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And we see a lot of stuff made by Benton Bush that were supplying to militia units. And mentioning the visors and how if they're stored in humidity or heat with a piece of paper under them, you can look at this one, you can see the underside of the visor where there's been some damage from the heat, humidity over time. And the linen thread that held the buttons on for the chin strap, you can see that's popped off. That's not uncommon. The thread dries out, it loses its strength, and it just breaks really easily. Another cool cap in the collection that I really like is this Massachusetts Volunteer Militia Officers Kepi. It's got 5 rows of braid, and I think in the collection documents it said something about it being a lieutenant, but 5 rows of braid would be a colonel or a general. So this particular one, if you look on the front, you can see the embroidered insignia that says MVM, and above it is a star in the middle. More than likely, this was worn by a brigadier general in the Mass Volunteer Militia. Great condition, blue superfine wool body, and then the band is black velvet. Next time when we get this out, we'll get some pictures. The chin strap's flopped back. The chin strap would be worn in front, right underneath that embroidered insignia. It just needs to be flipped back over. The visor is made from, again, jack leather, blackened leather, where they die cut, they stamp. They have a pattern and they stamp them all out. Here's the back, and you can really see the rows of braid. Now, those are all sewn on by hand. Having reproduced a couple of these before, it's a royal pain in the butt. They really knew what they were doing. And we're moving up in time now. We're getting to World War I. And this great 2nd Division Marine helmet, which is also over here on the table. It's a Model 17 is what it's called, Brody style helmet. It was copied from the British. We were copying the helmet that they were using. And it's a really crappy design. And you can see that it's going to do pretty much absolutely nothing to protect your head from damage. But they were used up until 1941, with the last one would have been the 1917 A1, which they basically used the same shell with a different lining and chin strap. And you can see some early World War II photos, maybe soldiers at Guam or some of the other Pacific theaters wearing the same type of helmet at the beginning of World War II. The 4th Brigade of Marines, this is the cool thing about this. You got the 2nd Division insignia with the Indian head and the star. That would have been the 2nd Infantry Division. In World War I. And in World War II, they had basically, even today, they have the same patch, but above it is a globe and anchor from the United States Marines. So the 4th Brigade of Marines was attached to the 2nd Division in World War I. There were 280 officers and 9,164 enlisted men. So this was probably painted for one of the officers and enlisted men right at the end of the war. But painted helmets are desirable for collectors, and painted Marine Corps helmets are even more desirable. This one has its original liner and chin strap. A lot of times, the liner and chin strap are gone in these because there's a central rivet right in the center of the crown that goes through, and it holds, the strap is integral. The chin strap goes from the center of that rivet all the way down through a couple of loops and then buckles on your chin. So if that leather breaks right at that rivet, the whole thing comes flying out. Again, not a great design for many reasons. And then we have a World War II M1 helmet. It's what we call a swivel bail. So this type of helmet, when the 1917 A1 went out in 1941, they started producing this M1 helmet, which gave the head more protection. And if some of you guys are in the military, you probably wore this type of helmet up through when they made the change in the 80s, in the 60s, 70s, Vietnam. They were still using the same style of helmet with a little variation. There's a band that runs around the base of the helmet. You can see where there's paint loss on it here. They changed that from steel to magnesium in 1944, and they put the seam, there's a seam where it comes together in the back. On this one, this is the front seam helmet. So this would have been produced between 1942, 1944, and it was worn by Hingham resident Ebenezer White and Gay. Now I tried to pull his service records to see what I could find out about him. However, a lot of the World War II records burned and are lost. I'm sure if I did some digging around here, I could find some more out about him. But it's nice to have these pieces from people from the Revolutionary, oops, stupid mic. I hate that thing. From the Revolutionary War all the way through to World War II. There's a lot more here in the collection. I don't know how much you guys have looked around, but maybe sometime we can talk about doing a day where we can pull some things out and share some of the other wonderful things that are here. These are a few other images that just show the chin strap. Chin strap for the lining is broken, and I do have a replacement, an original one that I'll give you guys for that. So anyway, thank you for listening, and hopefully I only saw a few people fluttering in the eyes fluttering in the back. Hopefully it wasn't too boring, but I wanted to try and cover that canteen stuff at the beginning too. And hopefully if you guys get any ideas on where to look, that would be great. And hopefully I'll be able to see you guys in a few years and talk more about canteens to keep you asleep.
Well, we're not going to let you go yet.
Can't run away yet.
Is better? Can you hear this one? Just checking the mics. So anyone in the audience who'd like to ask a question? We also, I know, have a couple of questions coming in on Zoom, but happy to pass the mic.
Better be a good one.
Maybe it's just because of a pandemic that it made me think of it, but the canteens in the beginning were personalized.
Okay, so, oh, go ahead.
Just to finish it, and then it, oh, sorry. No one ever tells me to shush. Okay, and then to follow it though, you did mention a story where he had to give the canteen back, or he had to pay for a canteen that he didn't give back at the end.
That was, okay, there's the first thing you're talking about, the marked canteens, the wooden ones, right? Okay, so when Joseph Elliott, the first canteen that I showed, when he was issued his canteen, either he carved it or somebody else carved it so we would know it was his. There's a lot of times where they might just put, like the other ones just says RM 1775. And if someone was taking a group of canteens to get water, at least they'd know they were getting the right canteen back. Yeah, or like sometimes you have carved powder horns. Sometimes you would have a guy that was skilled at doing that, and you'd pay him and he'd carve your powder horn for you. So it could have been Joseph Elliott that carved it, or it could have been, obviously the RM 75 wasn't as nice as the Joseph Elliott carving. And that's why that canteen was so spectacular, was because of the carving. They also did some of these things with like powder horns. They would mark their initials on the pine plug. so they'd know whose was whose if they weren't marked on the horn itself. Now the later canteen was Loring Cushing. That was probably a 1858 bullseye or smooth side canteen. Probably either had a sky blue cover, same color as the overcoat, or it had a piece of jean cloth covering it. And sometimes they mark those with their name, sometimes with a company letter and number. But who knows? He may have just put down that haversack and canteen and lost it. So.
They did, even though they personalized it, they didn't give it back.
Well, if you lost something in service, that meant that it needed to be replaced again. So he had to pay for it. So he lost those items, he had to pay. So they were government property.
We have another question from the audience here.
Two quick questions. There must have been a quartermaster function in the mid 1700s. All the canteens coming out of production had to be ordered by some functional entity. Who would that be?
It was the Committee of Supplies. So they were a part of the Committee of Safety. And again, Benjamin Lincoln was a member of this committee. There were other committee members too. And the other committee members were busy getting other supplies. And you had, David Cheever and others from the North Shore who were getting fish and beef and pork. And you had other people shipping in musket balls. Benjamin Lincoln, maybe because we haven't found any correspondence yet, but maybe he knew, obviously, people in Hingham could make this stuff. And so he was the one who purchased the stuff, purchased the canteens here. The state paid for them. Because you got to remember when the provincial Congress formed, we stopped paying taxes to the British. Henry Gardner from Stowe, Massachusetts became the treasurer, and the provincial Congress started going to all these towns saying, hey, you pay your taxes to us now. And so they were taking that money and they were using it to buy these supplies. So they would have a guy like Benjamin Lincoln come down, hit up all the suppliers around here, and then pay them for all the they'd come up with a price and pay them for all the canteens, and all that came out of the government.
Quick question on the muskets. You showed ballistic gelatin. What was the distance of the barrel to the gelatin?
So that was 25 yards.
25.
Yeah, because the block, we now have a form, we can melt the gel and make a bigger form, but the block is this big. So we were trying to hit that block at 25 yards with a smoothbore musket. So needless to say, there was a few shots to actually hit the gel.
Eyesight issues, right?
Well, yeah, and I got really bad eyesight, so I wasn't the shooter on that one.
I'm going to get a couple of questions that have come in over Zoom. One back to the canteens. How much water do you think one of these canteens would hold, and would it leak?
They were made to hold a quart. So some of the documents mentioned a wooden bottle. Well, people were confused by that, going, wait a minute, a wooden bottle? Well, bottle in the 18th century was a term, it was used as a measurement also, and it was to hold a quart. So the canteens were supposed to hold a quart of water, and yes, they leak like a sieve. Some do, some don't. They were made with the 2 pine drums in that ash or oak stave, single stave. And, the water would swell the wood and hopefully keep it from leaking too much. But a lot of times, having used these canteens, because I've had some made and tried them out, inevitably they end up running down your leg and, the water runs out, but hopefully it'll hold water for a while. And again, these weren't made to last forever. It's amazing that there are some that survive. I have a few friends that have them in their collections. But, given the amount that were made, it's good that there are still some that survive, but they weren't made during the time to last for a long time.
Question about rifles. Are there other long powder rifles in the Society's collections? And Paul is standing here. I don't know if you know off the top of your head if there are other long powder rifles in the Society's collections.
I think we may have some.
Yeah, there are a few other guns in the collection. Now, that one particular isn't a rifle. It's a smoothbore, but I think there are a couple of rifles in the collection too.
We also, I would just say, had a replica that was made for a member of the militia, the Hingham militia, in the 1970s, which is a replica of essentially of the musket that Joel's been talking about.
The replica that you have was made by a company in Japan called Bruneau Co, and they were made to be a replica of the pattern 1769 British musket that's sitting over here. And a lot of reenactment groups use those guns. They're also reproduced in Italy. And there's some really bad ones now being made in India that I would want to shoot. Blow
Question,
up on.
are there black powder ranges in Massachusetts?
Yeah, I mean, you can go to, I think any of the gun clubs in Massachusetts have ranges you can shoot black powder. We set up our ballistic studies. We can't have a dirty gun range, if you know what I mean. If we're metal detecting, if we have to metal detect each round, we can't have spent casings and other bullets and things in the dirt. We have to be clean. So we had one of the people on the study had 350 acres, about an hour south of Atlanta. So I drove down with a load of guns and metal detectors, and we spent a week down on that property where we had it clean. We had made the berm with fresh dirt. We had checked it beforehand to make sure there was nothing in it so that we could metal detect everything. But yeah, as far as for modern shooting, most gun clubs will let you shoot black powder.
Any more questions in the live audience? Oh, I see one over here. Hold it up.
You showed two different Civil War caps. One was identified as a forage cap and one was identified as a kepi. Is there a difference?
Yes, yes. So the forage cap has kind of a, I don't know whether I can go back on. Let's go back. Okay. So if you look at the kepi, see how the crown is recessed into the top of the cap? How the wool curls down and the crown sits down inside it. It's got that little, this form of this band and then the separate rise that goes up. So it's kind of a shallower cap, but the crown sits down on it. If we go back to Loring Cushing's forage cap, you can see how the crown sits on top. It's a completely different style of cap. Just like when you look at the forage cap, the 1858 forage cap is similar to the McDowell, but you look at it and they're different. And the kepi is similar, but that looks different too. So they're all different styles. No, it was just style. I mean, we copied these from the French, and then we kind of put some of our own little things on it. But the French were the ones that were using that braiding system on the crown. So we just kind of copied them, which we did with a lot of stuff during that period. We copied the French a lot during the 1850s, 60s.
More questions in the room? One more.
In the video that you showed, when you were showing shooting the musket, and the first smoke and smaller flash that we saw was basically the igniter, and then you said you have to wait and see what happens when the gun really fires.
Mhm.
And then we did see the larger flash and the larger smoke cloud. And my question was, being the shooter or witnessing that shooting, how big was that flash of fire coming out the back and smoke, and how close did it come to the face of the person shooting it?
Oh, your face is right in there. So yeah, by the end of the day, we're wearing, if you notice, you can barely see it, but I'm wearing safety glasses because the stuff, the powder burn blows back. But also when that flint hits that piece of steel and sets the spark down into the pan to ignite the charge, a lot of times little bits of flint will break off. And they're like little razor blades or little knives. And if you get something like that in your eye, you're going to slice your eye wide open. So you got to be real careful when you're doing it. But yeah, I've gotten burned. And one of the things that reenactors do is they have a cover that goes on the side of the pan that blows the flash straight up. Because there are a lot of times when I used to reenact and there was a guy standing next to me and my flash protector had fallen down and the guy next to you is not too happy because that flame goes right into his face. So yeah, you gotta be careful with it. But obviously when we're doing this stuff, we have safety officers who watch everything and make sure that we're doing everything safely so nobody gets hurt.
Anything else in the room? I think we've answered the questions on Zoom. Let me just Thank you so much, Joel. What a fascinating program. Such a range of material that you covered. Really appreciate your interest in canteens. I think we learned a lot about very interesting
Probably more than
history
you'll ever
from
wanna
that.
know.
That was fabulous. I want to give another thank you also, though, to Paula Bagger for all the work behind the scenes. When something like this comes together, a lot of things have to happen, and Paula really took a lot on her shoulders to make sure Joel had access to the materials he wanted to look at. He came to visit and looked at things. Then photographs had to be taken. Paula's wonderful husband, Jim, was our volunteer photographer for that work. So thank you to Jim. And a thank you to the volunteers who make this happen, many of whom you saw as you walked in the door today. Some of those are members of the Education Committee, including Laura Thompson, who's prepared a wonderful reception for afterwards on the second floor. But thank you to all the volunteers in all of these programs. We couldn't do it without you. So I would like to invite everyone to join us for the next program on March 13th, which is our 5th in the Out of the Box series. Mark Goodman, who some of you may know from his many years of involvement in the piano department at the South Shore Conservatory, will be sharing his knowledge of keyboard history and playing period compositions. He'll be covering the evolution from the so-called square piano of the 18th century, an example of which some of you may have seen in our Kelly Gallery, to the 20th century era baby grand, which we also have in our collection. So really interesting to see that transition. He's done a lot of research on period music for this presentation. Finally, I want to invite those of you here at the museum today to join us for some light refreshments, which we have available on the second floor in the ballroom. And thank all of you who once again joined us through the magic of Zoom. This concludes our Zoom recording for today. Thank you. It's really been wonderful to get questions through Zoom as well as your live audience. With that, I will look forward to seeing some of you down on the second floor. Thank you very much.